New York City. Before the Mafia ruled the streets, there were gangs. Ruthless, violent, untouchable. They ran neighborhoods, fixed elections, and spilled blood for power. The 5 Points Gang, the Bowery Boys, the Dead Rabbits, the Whyos, and the Eastman Gang. They built the underworld from the gutters, long before organized crime had a name. But behind every gang was a leader, killers, hustlers, and street legends who shaped the city's dark history. How did they rise? How did they fall? And what made them more feared than the Mafia itself? This is the story of the gangs that ruled New York, before the Mafia ever existed. The 5 Points Gang. The 5 Points Gang was one of the most notorious and influential criminal organizations in New York City during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Originating in the infamous 5 Points neighborhood of Lower Manhattan, the gang emerged as a dominant force in organized crime, setting the stage for the rise of later criminal enterprises, including the Italian-American Mafia. The 5 Points area itself was a breeding ground for violence, corruption, and vice, with its overcrowded slums providing the perfect environment for gang activity to flourish. Composed primarily of Irish and Italian immigrants, the gang controlled various illegal operations, including extortion, gambling, and protection rackets, while engaging in frequent violent clashes with rival gangs. The 5 Points Gang was initially formed as a loose collection of street toughs, but it gained notoriety under the leadership of Paul Kelly, an Italian-American born as Paolo Antonio Vaccarelli. Kelly, a former professional boxer, was a cunning and charismatic leader who transformed the gang into a more organized and disciplined criminal enterprise. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Kelly emphasized structure and hierarchy within the gang, recruiting skilled fighters and enforcing loyalty among his members. His ability to speak both English and Italian allowed him to bridge the gap between Irish and Italian factions, making the 5 Points Gang one of the most ethnically diverse criminal organizations of its time. Under Kelly's leadership, the 5 Points Gang expanded its operations beyond simple street brawls and petty crimes. They infiltrated legitimate businesses, manipulated elections through voter fraud and intimidation, and established strong ties with corrupt politicians and law enforcement officials. The gang also played a significant role in controlling the city's brothels, saloons, and illegal gambling dens. Their growing influence attracted young recruits eager for power and money, and many of these recruits would later become infamous figures in American organized crime. One of the most notable protégés of the 5 Points Gang was Charles Lucky Luciano, who would go on to become a founding figure of the modern Mafia. Violence was an integral part of the 5 Points Gang's operations. Turf wars with rival gangs, such as Monk Eastman's gang, were commonplace, often leading to brutal street fights and assassinations. The rivalry between Paul Kelly and Monk Eastman became legendary, culminating in a series of bloody confrontations that caught the attention of city authorities. In one infamous battle, hundreds of gang members clashed in a full-scale street war, leaving numerous dead and wounded. The level of violence and public outcry eventually led to a crackdown by law enforcement, resulting in the arrests of many key figures, including Kelly himself. Despite these setbacks, the 5 Points Gang remained a dominant force in New York's underworld for several years. However, by the 1910s, the gang began to decline as internal conflicts, increased police pressure, and the rise of more structured criminal organizations led to its eventual dissolution. Many of its members, including Lucky Luciano, transitioned into more sophisticated forms of organized crime, paving the way for the emergence of the Italian-American Mafia. The legacy of the 5 Points Gang lived on through these successors as they adopted and refined the gang's methods of operation, transforming street-level criminality into a highly organized and lucrative enterprise. The 5 Points Gang's impact on American organized crime cannot be overstated. It served as a training ground for future mafia leaders and established many of the criminal tactics that would later define the underworld. The gang's ability to manipulate politics, enforce loyalty, and control illicit businesses set a precedent for the mafia's rise to power in the 20th century. Even as the 5 Points Gang faded into history, its influence could still be felt in the operations of the powerful crime families that dominated New York for decades to come. The Bowery Boys. The Bowery Boys were one of the most prominent and feared gangs in New York City during the mid-19th century. Emerging from the working-class neighborhoods of the Bowery district, the gang became a symbol of both political influence and street violence during a period of intense social unrest. Unlike many other gangs of the time, the Bowery Boys were largely composed of native-born Protestant Americans, setting them apart from the predominantly Irish and immigrant gangs that populated the city's underworld. Their identity was rooted in nativist ideology, and they often clashed with immigrant groups, particularly the Irish Catholic Dead Rabbits, in violent street battles that defined the era. The Bowery Boys represented the intersection of organized crime and political power, aligning themselves with the anti-immigrant Know-Nothing Party and using their muscle to control voting districts and enforce their will on the streets. The gang's origins can be traced to the 1840s, when the Bowery neighborhood became a hotbed of political agitation and social division. The Bowery Boys operated not only as a street gang but also as enforcers for the city's nativist political movements, advocating for the rights of native-born Americans over those of newly arrived immigrants. Dressed in distinctive attire that included stovepipe hats, red shirts, and black trousers, they were instantly recognizable on the streets of New York. Their fashion choices were both a badge of honor and an intimidation tactic, signaling their allegiance to the gang and their defiance of rival groups. The Bowery Boys were known for their brash confidence, often marching through enemy territories in broad daylight to provoke confrontations. Violence was a central part of the Bowery Boys' identity. The gang regularly engaged in street brawls, riots, and pitched battles with rival gangs, most notably the Dead Rabbits, a predominantly Irish gang that represented the opposite side of the city's ethnic and political divide. These conflicts often erupted during elections, with both gangs serving as hired muscle for opposing political factions. One of the most infamous clashes occurred during the Dead Rabbits Riot of 1857, when the two gangs waged a 2-day battle in the streets of Lower Manhattan, leaving dozens dead and the neighborhood in ruins. The riot highlighted the deep social tensions between native-born Americans and immigrants, as well as the violent role that gangs played in shaping the city's political landscape. Despite their reputation for brutality, the Bowery Boys were not simply common thugs. Many of their members held legitimate jobs as mechanics, firefighters, and tradesmen, using their positions to exert influence over the city's working-class communities. The gang maintained close ties with the city's volunteer fire companies, particularly the Bowery-based Engine Company No. 6, which often served as a front for the gang's activities. Firehouses became unofficial headquarters where members would gather, plan their operations, and protect their territory. The Bowery Boys' dual role as both protectors and predators allowed them to maintain a complex relationship with the community, blending civic duty with criminal enterprise. As the city grew and changed, the Bowery Boys' influence began to wane. The rise of professional police forces, combined with the decline of nativist political movements, gradually eroded the gang's power. By the late 1860s, the gang had largely disbanded, with many of its members either fading into obscurity or joining more organized criminal enterprises. However, their legacy endured as a symbol of the volatile mixture of crime, politics, and social unrest that defined New York during the 19th century. The Bowery Boys' impact on the city's underworld was profound, laying the groundwork for the later rise of more sophisticated gangs and organized crime syndicates. Their story remains a testament to the chaotic and often brutal struggle for power in one of America's greatest cities. The Dead Rabbits. The Dead Rabbits were one of the most notorious street gangs to emerge from the turbulent slums of New York City during the mid-19th century. Operating primarily in the Five Points neighborhood, the gang became infamous for its violence, fierce loyalty, and deep involvement in the city's political and criminal underworld. The Dead Rabbits were predominantly composed of Irish immigrants, many of whom had fled the devastating Irish potato famine and found themselves trapped in the overcrowded, impoverished tenements of Lower Manhattan. The gang's name, often said to have come from an Irish slang term meaning a strong and fearless man, became synonymous with the desperate struggle of immigrant communities to assert themselves in a hostile and unforgiving city. The Dead Rabbits were not just a criminal gang, but also a powerful social force within the Irish-American community. They emerged during a time of intense ethnic tension when newly arrived immigrants faced discrimination, poverty, and exploitation. The gang functioned as both a protector and an enforcer for the Irish population, defending their neighborhoods from rival gangs and corrupt law enforcement, while also engaging in extortion, theft, and other criminal enterprises. Their fierce loyalty to the Irish cause earned them a reputation as both heroes and villains, depending on who was telling the story. They were closely aligned with the Tammany Hall political machine, which relied on the gang's muscle to secure votes and maintain control over key voting districts. The Dead Rabbits' rivalry with the Bowery Boys became one of the most legendary gang feuds in New York's history. The two gangs represented opposite sides of the city's ethnic and political divide, with the native-born Protestant Bowery Boys advocating for nativist policies, while the Irish Catholic Dead Rabbits fought to defend the rights of immigrants. Their conflicts often erupted into bloody street battles that terrorized the city's residents. The most infamous of these clashes was the Dead Rabbits Riot of 1857, a two-day battle that saw hundreds of gang members fighting with clubs, knives, and firearms in the streets of the Five Points. The riot left several dead and many more wounded, while entire blocks of the neighborhood were reduced to rubble. The violence only ended when the newly formed Metropolitan Police intervened, but the event cemented the Dead Rabbits' place in the city's history. Despite their violent reputation, the Dead Rabbits were more than just a gang of thugs. They played a crucial role in the social and political life of the Irish community, providing a sense of belonging and protection in a hostile environment. Many gang members were involved in labor unions and political organizations, using their strength and numbers to advocate for better working conditions and housing for their fellow immigrants. The gang's ties to Tammany Hall allowed them to wield significant influence in local elections, with members often serving as poll watchers, vote enforcers, or even candidates themselves. This blending of criminal activity and political power became a defining feature of New York's underworld for decades to come. As the city evolved and the Irish community became more established, the Dead Rabbits' influence began to wane. The professionalization of the police force and the decline of street gangs as political enforcers gradually diminished their power. By the late 1860s, the gang had largely disbanded, with many of its members either absorbed into other criminal organizations or transitioning into more legitimate pursuits. However, their legacy endured as a symbol of the struggles faced by Irish immigrants in 19th-century New York. The Dead Rabbits represented both the brutality and the resilience of a community fighting for its place in a new world. Their story became a cornerstone of New York's criminal folklore, immortalized in literature, film, and the city's collective memory. The Whyos. The Whyos were one of the most feared and influential gangs in New York City during the late 19th century, marking a brutal chapter in the city's criminal history. Emerging in the aftermath of the Civil War, the gang operated primarily in Lower Manhattan, where it carved out a reputation for violence, extortion, and organized crime. The Whyos represented a new breed of criminal enterprise, blending the chaotic street violence of earlier gangs with a more structured and profitable approach to crime. Their name is believed to have come from the distinctive bird-like whistle members used to signal one another, a sound that became synonymous with fear and impending violence on the city's streets. The gang's rise coincided with a period of rapid urbanization and social upheaval, making them a dominant force in New York's underworld during the 1870s and 1880s. Unlike earlier gangs that often operated as loose collections of street toughs, the Whyos functioned with a higher degree of organization and hierarchy. The gang's leadership imposed strict discipline among its members, enforcing loyalty and coordinating criminal activities across the city. Their operations extended far beyond petty theft and street brawls, encompassing extortion rackets, prostitution rings, and contract killings. The Whyos were among the first gangs to offer what they called a menu of criminal services, with prices set for various acts of violence ranging from simple beatings to murder. This business-like approach to crime made them one of the most profitable and feared gangs of their time. The gang's most notorious leader, Danny Lyons, exemplified the Whyos' blend of brutality and cunning. Lyons was a charismatic figure who commanded both fear and loyalty among his followers. Under his leadership, the gang expanded its influence into the city's saloons, gambling dens, and brothels, establishing a network of illegal enterprises that generated substantial income. Lyons' reign was marked by frequent turf wars with rival gangs and bloody conflicts with law enforcement. His violent exploits became the stuff of legend, further enhancing the Whyos' fearsome reputation. However, Lyons' career came to an abrupt end when he was shot and killed in 1888, a testament to the brutal life expectancy of New York's gang leaders. Despite their reputation for violence, the Whyos maintained close ties to the city's political and business elite, much like their predecessors. Corrupt politicians and police officials often turned a blind eye to the gang's activities in exchange for bribes or favors. This relationship allowed the Whyos to operate with relative impunity, using their muscle to influence elections and intimidate opponents. The gang's ability to blend criminal enterprise with political power set a precedent that would later be adopted by more organized crime syndicates, including the Mafia. As the 19th century drew to a close, the Whyos' influence began to decline. The rise of more sophisticated criminal organizations, combined with increased police crackdowns, gradually eroded their power. Many members were arrested, killed, or absorbed into other gangs, while others sought more legitimate pursuits. By the early 20th century, the Whyos had largely faded from the city's streets, but their legacy endured as a bridge between the chaotic gang violence of the mid-19th century and the more organized criminal enterprises that would dominate the 20th century. The Whyos' story remains a testament to the brutal, often short-lived power struggles that defined New York's underworld during one of its most turbulent eras, the Eastman Gang. The Eastman Gang was one of the most powerful and feared criminal organizations in New York City during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Emerging from the chaotic streets of the Lower East Side, the gang rose to prominence under the leadership of Edward "Monk" Eastman, a towering figure whose blend of violence, cunning, and street charisma made him one of the city's most notorious gang leaders. The Eastman Gang controlled large swaths of Manhattan's criminal underworld, engaging in a wide range of illicit activities, including extortion, robbery, prostitution, and protection rackets. Their reign marked a brutal period in New York's history, with the gang's operations serving as a blueprint for the more organized criminal syndicates that would follow. The gang's origins can be traced to the early 1890s, when Monk Eastman began assembling a group of street toughs from the densely populated Jewish and immigrant neighborhoods of the Lower East Side. Unlike many of the city's other gangs, which were often organized along ethnic lines, the Eastman Gang was remarkably diverse, including Irish, Italian, and Jewish members. Eastman's willingness to recruit from different communities helped him build one of the largest and most formidable gangs in New York. The gang's headquarters was located at the Silver Dollar Saloon, a notorious dive bar that served as both a meeting place and a fortress for the gang's operations. Violence was a defining feature of the Eastman Gang. Monk Eastman himself was a larger-than-life figure, known for his brutal fists, love of pigeons, and unpredictable temper. He led his men into countless street battles, often armed with clubs, knives, and pistols. The gang's most bitter rival was the 5 Points Gang, led by Paul Kelly, and their bloody turf wars became legendary. The feud between the two gangs reached its peak in the early 1900s, with gunfights breaking out regularly in the streets of Lower Manhattan. These battles left dozens dead and turned entire neighborhoods into war zones, forcing the police to intervene on numerous occasions. Despite the violence, the authorities often found themselves powerless to dismantle the gang's operations, as Eastman's influence extended deep into the city's political and police circles. In addition to their street-level crimes, the Eastman Gang played a significant role in New York's political underworld. Like many other gangs of the era, they were heavily involved in election fraud and voter intimidation, working as hired muscle for Tammany Hall, the city's dominant political machine. In exchange for their services, the gang enjoyed a degree of protection from the law, allowing them to operate with near impunity. This mutually beneficial relationship further cemented the gang's power and blurred the lines between organized crime and city politics. Despite his fearsome reputation, Monk Eastman's downfall came not from his enemies, but from his own reckless behavior. In 1904, he was arrested for assault and sentenced to prison, effectively ending his reign over the gang. Without his leadership, the Eastman Gang began to fracture, with several factions breaking away to form their own criminal enterprises. Eastman's later attempts to reclaim his power were unsuccessful, and he ultimately found himself on the fringes of the underworld he had once ruled. In a final twist of fate, Eastman enlisted in the U.S. Army during World War I, earning a medal for bravery on the battlefield. However, his violent past eventually caught up with him, and he was gunned down in 1920 on a New York street, bringing an end to one of the most infamous lives in the city's criminal history. Though the Eastman Gang eventually faded into history, its impact on New York's underworld was profound. The gang's structure, methods, and political connections served as a model for the more organized and disciplined crime syndicates that would dominate the 20th century. Many of its former members went on to join the ranks of the Italian and Jewish Mafia, bringing with them the lessons they had learned under Monk Eastman's brutal leadership. The Eastman Gang's legacy remains a key chapter in the evolution of organized crime, bridging the chaotic violence of the city's early gangs with the more sophisticated criminal empires that would follow.